So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 9th South-South Forum on Sustainability, whose central theme is the collapse of modern civilization and the future of humanity. The topic of tonight's talk, which is very relevant for our crisis-ridden times, is stagflation and sustainable development. My name is Tungyi Ko, and I am the moderator for this evening's session. By way of brief introduction, I'm an Arena Fellow and a Research Fellow at the Center of Cultural Research and Development at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. I was previously a postdoc at the Department of Anthropology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'm also a founding member of the Global University of Sustainability. I obtained a PhD in social anthropology from SOAS at the University of London in 2019, and also a PhD in cultural studies from Lingnan University in 2014, where Dr. Lau Kin-chi was my supervisor. Prior to this, I had training in heterodox economics, political economy, and sociology in both Australia and the US. I have multidisciplinary research interests that revolve around the possibility of attaining the good life under conditions of modernity. My current research interests include the sociology/anthropology of COVID-19, geopolitics, political economy, globalization, colonialism and decoloniality, the sociology of sports, Chinese medicine and philosophy, and Chinese modernization in general. Tonight's distinguished speaker would be well known to the South-South Forum audience. He's none other than Dr. Kwame Sundaram JOMO, perhaps more popularly and fondly known as KS JOMO, who, if I recall correctly, is participating at the forum for the 3rd consecutive year. Dr. JOMO is Senior Advisor at the Khazanah Research Institute. He's also a Fellow of the Academy of Science in Malaysia, Emeritus Professor at the University of Malaya, Visiting Fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Columbia University, and Visiting Professor at the International Islamic University in Malaysia. JOMO was a member of the Economic Action Council chaired by the 7th Malaysian Prime Minister from 2019 to 2020, and the 5-member Council of Eminent Persons appointed by him. He was a UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs from 2005 to 2012, Research Coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs and Development from 2006 to 2012, Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations from 2012 to 2015, and 3rd holder of the Tun Hussein On Chair in International Studies at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, from 2016 to 2017. In 2007, he received the Wassily Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. JOMO has authored and edited over 100 books and translated 12 volumes, besides writing many academic papers and media articles. He was professor in the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya until November 2004. Founder Director of the Institute of Social Analysis and Founder Chair in 2001 to 2004 of IDEAS, International Development Economic Associates. He was an independent member of the National Economic Consultative Council from 1989 to 1991, President of the Malaysian Social Science Association, and founding convener of the International Malaysian Studies Conference. He was also on the board of the United Nations Research Institute on Social Development in Geneva. He is on the editorial boards of several learned journals. So please welcome our distinguished speaker tonight. The talk will last for approximately 45 minutes to an hour, followed by an approximately 20-minute intervention by our discussants for the evening, Dr. C.P. CHANDRASEKHAR and Dr. Anu Chenoy. I will formally introduce our discussants before they begin their segments. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Jomo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ko. And thank you also to Dr. Lau Kin Chi and Dr. Sit Chue, who have been very instrumental in developing the South-South Forum on Sustainability over almost a decade. It gives me great pleasure to talk to you all today, and I also would like to register my discussants, my appreciation to the discussants who have kindly taken on this responsibility. I'm looking forward to a lively and robust discussion. As Dr. Ko has reminded us, this is a very pressing issue and an issue which affects all of us in very profound but different ways. And this, I think, is the crux of the problem. Allow me to begin with a bit of historical background, because at the core of this is the international monetary system and how it has evolved over time. I think it is all very well known that the depression, which began after the great crash of 1929 on Wall Street, eventually, through a very long and devious route, led to the convening of the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire before the end of the Second World War, largely at the behest of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in anticipation of the end of British monetary hegemony of the pre-war period, and in anticipation, arguably, of US hegemony. Now, of course, as we know, the Bretton Woods institution was convened as the United Nations Conference on Monetary and Financial Affairs. I emphasize this because in President Roosevelt's conception, the whole question of the establishment of the three institutions which were envisaged at the conference is linked very fundamentally to the establishment of the United Nations in the following year, and very, very importantly, for the creation of the conditions for lasting peace and economic prosperity. This, unfortunately, is a hope which has been betrayed. And it's also important to recognize that while two of the three institutions envisaged were created, although in arguably distorted form, in the form of the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, better known as the World Bank. The third institution which was envisaged was the International Trade Organization, which did not materialize, largely due to the opposition of the US Congress in 1948-49. Now, this was, of course, as we know, the World Trade Organization was created in 1995. But I would argue that the World Trade Organization is a fundamentally different type of creature from what was envisaged in the 1940s, and in a way fundamentally betrays the role of governing an international trading system as was envisaged in the 1940s. So if we think about the kinds of debates which took place in 1944, without going into any details, I think it is important to realize that the US position, the position of the US Treasury prevailed over the UK, United Kingdom Treasury, by and large. Although many of the key institutions which were suggested by Keynes, who led the UK delegation, subsequently came into existence. Now, at the beginning, right from the beginning, when the IMF was created, it consisted of only 44 countries. One has to understand, of course, the wartime conditions. But it's important to emphasize that of those 44 countries, 28 would be deemed developing countries. And 19 of those 28 were Latin American countries, because in some ways they were less affected by the war which was largely being fought in Europe and Asia. The emphasis I want to reiterate was not just on monetary and financial stability, but also a very clear emphasis on sustaining growth, for creating jobs, for post-war reconstruction, and I want to emphasize post-colonial development. Hence the name of the World Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Now, this system, the Bretton Woods system, as it came to be known, where there was a certain privilege, the US dollar was privileged by pegging the price of gold at $35 per ounce of gold, gave the US a certain advantage, a certain privilege, which French finance minister subsequently referred to as an exorbitant privilege, which has been fundamentally problematic in the system ever since then. This basically came to an end in 1971, mainly due, many would argue, to huge US spending, huge US deficit during the 1960s, but especially due to wage the war in Vietnam. This basically resulted in a situation where the euro-dollar market, which had emerged not only in Europe, but in fact in the rest of the world, dollars internationally, the Europeans began to challenge the premise of this euro-dollar market, the reserve currency system, and basically in 1971, in August 1971, President Richard Nixon put an end to this. So basically, I think a very important problem of Bretton Woods was not resolved by this particular ending. And that problem, of course, is that the countries' economies running trade surpluses are not deterred by the system. And this is a fundamental problem which continues to affect us today. Now, moving very quickly on, one of my old teachers, Robert Triffin, from a small country, Belgium, referred to the system, what emerged after 1971 as a non-system with the end of Bretton Woods. And it's important, I think, for us to recognize that much of the regulation which was created for the Bretton Woods system continues to exist to this day, but often inadequate. It is inadequate and inappropriate. And so we have a situation of significant financial deregulation, which has also taken place in a number of countries, led especially by the US. And I want to emphasize that this was not led by, for example, the Republicans. It was really led by the so-called New Democrats, of people like President Clinton and specifically Treasury Secretary Rubin. So what has emerged with all this financial deregulation is an appeal to self-regulation. But in effect, this is a system which is heavily under domination of the US, and this, I think, is a huge problem. I want to emphasize that there is one particular article, Article 6 of the IMF, which nonetheless allows for countries, for governments to control their capital account, to manage their capital account. Okay, and this unfortunately has been it's been a very important provision, but the leadership of the IMF, especially from the 1990s into the last decade, did not honor this until Dominique Strauss-Kahn became the managing director. During that period of almost 2 decades, the IMF leadership did not recognize this, and in fact, allowed, sometimes even tacitly encouraged capital account liberalization, which is part of the problem which we face, part of the problem which led to the Asian financial crisis, which is part of the problem which arguably led to the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Now, the situation, therefore, is one where we have a reform agenda which is for the South, for developing countries. I think it's very important to recognize that in this very uncertain world, where we are relatively minor players, even the big countries are relatively minor players, the system, the governance of the IMF and so on and so forth actually understate the significance of developing countries and overstate the significance of rich countries. So you have, for example, international trade among the European countries, which are actually already have had a common market for several decades, being measured as if, just imagine if the interstate trade in the US was also considered as part of their trade. You can imagine that the US would actually have a higher weight compared to Europe. But for the rest of the world, which we are actually underrepresented and under government, and the system has actually become worse. I mentioned earlier that developing countries were important from the outset, and at the beginning in the 1940s, developing countries had what is called the vote of the developing countries in the IMF came to about 45%. Okay, today it is less than 20%. In fact, it went down as low as 11%. Until China managed to increase its bargaining position. So we have a situation where developing countries have actually been grossly underrepresented, and they have very, very little voice as a consequence. They certainly are not in a position to exercise control over this system. So this has actually ensured that rather than having a financial system at the international level, which is more conducive to development, and incentives for a developmental system, we actually have the contrary. What we have, in a sense, privileges financial assets, and this has been extremely problematic. And what we see, of course, is that we need to include, as a consequence, a much more inclusive financial system, not only at the international level, but also at the national level. And we need to ensure a greater voice for developing countries in this context. There was an effort by the UN in the form of the Financing for Development Conference in Monterrey, Mexico in 1992, but the progress achieved by the UN has been modest at best. It's also very important to recognize that in many international financial issues, the most reactionary force is actually the Club of Rich Countries, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And this is very, very clearly seen, for example, in questions of international tax cooperation, which have been discussed, which are very important for all of us to take cognizance of. So what we have seen since the global financial crisis of 2008-2009 is greater fiscal consolidation, as it is politely termed. In other words, austerity. And as you know, there's some social mobilization around the whole question of austerity. And there are also serious problems of global imbalances and exchange rate fluctuations and so on and so forth, which are hugely problematic. There are quite a number of issues which I don't have time to go into, but the efforts at international reform, but most significantly Basel III, as it is referred to in English, or BAL in French, basically have failed. And the FSB, the Financial Stability Bureau, I think it's called, basically is also heavily skewed towards the developed, the rich countries. So in other words, on the one hand, you do not have any reform of the vestiges, of the atavistic vestiges of the international monetary system, which after 1971, and there is no other effort going on to reform the international monetary and financial system, except to address some of the most glaring problems of the previous crisis, which is basically what you have in the form of the FSB as well as the Basel III proposals. So the consequence of this has been, as we all know, very lackluster economic performance since then, and we have had as a consequence basically the world economy has slowly but surely slowed down very considerably. Now, I think it's also important to recognize that that the latest economic shocks, and one of course is referring to the pandemic and to the war, but also very importantly, the further disruption of international trade by what are called sanctions. And I want to emphasize that these sanctions are not authorized by the United Nations. These sanctions basically have a net consequence of hitting back, of adversely affecting developing countries in particular, some of course much more than others. So, but the rising interest rates which have come about in recent months as a consequence of some rising prices, which would be important to discuss, is slowed by the fact that there's less private spending, and I think it's important to recognize that in some countries, undoubtedly, some of the relief provided during the pandemic was for the first time some trickle down to workers and others. But by and large, many developing countries could not afford much in terms of such relief measures, and so the whole economy, the whole world economy and national economies have tended to slow down as a consequence. Now, I think without getting into too much detail, you can see from this graph that the IMF has had to make downward revisions of its growth projections, 5 consecutive downward revisions over a period of about slightly over a year. Okay, yeah, this is just an incredible reminder that even before the pandemic, things were already bad, and not only bad, but going from bad to worse. Now, it's important also to recognize that much of this, of course, has been affected by a variety of problems which have emerged over the time period which we are looking at. And I think it's important to recognize that many of the promises of economists who claim that if you open up the capital account, there will be a flow of capital from the capital rich to the capital poor. This may have happened in the case of East Asia, but as far as the rest of the developing world is concerned, this certainly did not happen. We have, as a consequence, the cost of funds to developing countries has not gone down in any significant fashion. And it's also important to recognize that many of the old sources of economic volatility and stability may have declined, but in fact, this has been accompanied by new sources of stability and volatility. Now, I think when we are looking at the question of globalization, many of us think of globalization in terms of the spread of international trade. But I think it is very important to recognize that actually financial globalization has been far more significant than trade globalization. This was a chart prepared some time ago for the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the first half decade of the 21st century. And it clearly shows this this trend. And in fact, in the period, the decade and a half since then, this trend has actually not been reversed. In fact, many people would agree that the high tide of trade globalization was probably achieved around the turn of the century, and there has been relatively little growth of trade in the subsequent period, especially since the global financial crisis, because the global financial crisis saw a retreat of reduced trade openness, which was the premise for globalization in the earlier period. Now, as a consequence of this, we have seen a significant flow of capital from the south to the north. And it's useful for us to remind ourselves who is getting that capital. And you can see that at least in an earlier period, I've not been in a position to check all the recent numbers, but about half the capital was actually went to the United States. And not only in the form of people of developing countries and others buying US Treasury bonds, but also investing in the US, investing on Wall Street, and so on and so forth. So the US, contrary to the image of it being a net capital exporter, is in fact a net capital importer. Now, one might think that with all this money going around, that it would contribute to what economists call a gross fixed capital formation. As you can see from the upper line in this graph, in fact, gross fixed capital formation has hardly increased. In fact, it has been on a downward decline, even though financial investments have actually continued to grow tremendously in the recent period. Now, so I think it is very important for us, going back to Article 6 of the IMF, which is still on the books. It is still on the books, that in fact, developing countries have retain the right to exercise capital controls. And this is often important, especially in this situation of great instability and volatility, to try to keep real interest rates and interest rate margins as low as possible, and to try to be able to manage an exchange rate which is least adverse to the developmental interests of developing countries. Now, moving on very quickly, I think rather than calling these types of efforts capital controls, some of us, particularly following the Asian financial crisis, started using the term capital account management. And this sounds much more acceptable to some people. Some people are not particularly taken with it. So certainly I've been among those who have been advocating what we call capital account management. And there are, in fact, very pragmatic possibilities, which are, of course, very different from different types of economies. There's no one-size-fits-all proposition, but one should recognize that even when capital accounts are open, it's not an all-or-nothing proposition. There is the possibility of, for example, opening the capital account to encourage foreign direct investment if it is so desired, but basically to discourage portfolio investments. There are all kinds of ways of doing that, and this, I think, is part of the challenge which developing countries need to pay attention to. Now, without going, I won't go into any of the details right now because I'm really running low on time. But I think it is important to recognize that being able to have some control over macroeconomic policy is crucial for all developing countries. Of course, some of the bigger developing countries have a greater degree of control, and for many smaller developing countries, especially the far more open economies, there is far less scope, precisely because of the conditions of openness, to be able to have much macroeconomic space for macroeconomic management. Nonetheless, I think it is useful for us to recognize that by and large, many of the old lessons, sometimes now forgotten in more recent times, still remain relevant. I think it is important, for example, to recognize that fiscal stimuli continue to be very crucial, and part of the reason the last decade has been very lackluster, even before the pandemic, is precisely because the fiscal efforts which were put in 2009, for example, were abandoned almost immediately because of some misleading and false calls by some eminent economists, which are basically very, very misleading, but nonetheless forced many countries were misled into cutting back their fiscal efforts. Likewise, one should recognize that while there is a significant role for monetary policy, the role of monetary policy has been greatly exaggerated by the OECD countries during the last decade before the pandemic, and monetary policy should be very much coordinated, especially with fiscal policy. So I don't think there is a need to resort to modern monetary theory but I think it is important to recognize many lessons from, for want of a better term, development macroeconomics, or what some people would call applied Keynesianism for developing countries. Yet another issue, of course, is what constitutes exchange rate policy. What kind of exchange rate policy is most developmental? And so the whole idea of central bank independence is hugely problematic looked at from this point of view. You cannot have monetary policy going off in one direction, fiscal policy going off in another direction. That compounds the incoherence of macroeconomic policy in developing countries. So what we need really are consistently counter-cyclical policies. In slow times, in recessionary times, that you basically fiscal stimuli should basically be very supportive of growth, and then to withdraw that kind of or wind down that kind of fiscal stimuli if necessary, when you have growing conditions. This, I think, is quite important, and we certainly need to pay attention not only to output growth, but especially far more attention to employment growth, especially in developing countries. Now, let me quickly move on to then argue that the three principal macroeconomic targets should be the creation of employment, the moderation of inflation, and ensuring some degree of international competitiveness. This, of course, is easier said than done, and there's no general formula for all kinds of different countries, but I think this is very important for us to consider. Now, one of the big problems which tends to be emphasized, especially by the IMF, especially under the previous leadership of the IMF, past leaderships of the IMF, there has been heavy emphasis on stabilization. This has become very, very important for the IMF since the 1980s. And stabilization basically translates into lowering inflation, but also, very importantly, lowering growth, lowering employment. It is important to recognize that there is considerable literature which establishes that even low two-digit inflation is not problematic for growth. It is not self-accelerating. This is very important because there are a lot of myths which many economists, people working in central banks and elsewhere, pick up in school, in graduate school, and so on. And these kinds of myths have been part of the problem of macroeconomic policy making in developing countries. So it is important also that when you have a much more balanced macroeconomic objectives, that there should not be an inappropriate overreaction to inflationary pressures. Inflationary pressures should be seen as one of a number of challenges which macroeconomic policy needs to address. Now, one of the consequences of globalization and has been what some of us refer to as ethno-populism in many parts of the world. Initially, the term was popularized in the context of Sri Lanka, not recently, but in 1983, when there was ethnic targeting in Sri Lanka. Now, almost 4 decades later, we see that ethno-populism is not a phenomenon just of Sri Lanka. It's not a phenomenon peculiar to developing countries. It is widespread in developed countries. In developed countries, of course, many of the new so-called new thinking of promoting, for example, identity politics and so on, has inadvertently fed into some of the thinking which has led to ethno-populism in the West, and I would argue even in the East and elsewhere. But this is a huge problem. If we think about some of the problems of black on black targeting in South Africa, for example, and we think of some of the other problems in elsewhere in the world. But one of the major consequences, of course, is that it has been become increasingly legitimate and acceptable to be hostile to others. This is not, of course, certainly not conducive to peace and the maintenance of peace. But we have seen, for example, President Trump and then subsequently Prime Minister Abe calling for the reshoring of American and Japanese investments from China, not only from China, but from other parts of the world, to go back to the US, to go back to Japan, as if that would basically resume the industrialization of those, reverse the deindustrialization of those countries. Of course, that has not happened in either place, but nonetheless, that kind of thinking nonetheless has very, very important implications. So, coming now to COVID-19. COVID-19, of course, as we know, the control measures, attempts to deal with COVID-19 resulted in a number of consequences, and particularly a great number of supply-side disruptions, which I'm sure you can all imagine and you know of. But I think, and often it is also said that the Russian invasion of Ukraine also has been the cause of supply-side disruptions. But something else, namely the illegal sanctions which have been imposed by many countries, mainly against Russia, have also, and of course before that against Cuba, against Iran, and a whole variety of countries, have also been responsible for a great number of supply-side disruptions. So supply-side disruptions have somehow become legitimized in this new world which is unfortunately emerging. Now, I think it's useful for us to recognize that these supply-side disruptions have resulted in what economists call cost-push inflation, and But on the other hand, we have seen many central banks. The one exception was the Japanese central bank, Governor Kuroda. But basically, central banks generally increase their interest rates in response to this situation. And of course, raising interest rates is not going to address any kind of supply side disruption. I mean, you don't need to be an economist to recognize that. And so the consequence of raising these interest rates is basically in economic stagnation. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist myself, but many people would say that this raising of interest rates is basically an attack on the working class in the United States, as with Volcker raising of interest rates in 1980. The raising of interest rates now, you just remind yourself of what kinds of things were being talked about in 2021. People were talking about the so-called Great Resignation because there was full employment once again in the US. And as a consequence of the full employment, many people were becoming a bit more selective about the jobs they were in. And then this phenomenon, the so-called Great Resignation, was happening. And so this is seen by many people as an attempt to reverse this situation of close to full employment and the improvement of working conditions and real wages as a consequence, which, by the way, as you all know, have actually declined for the last 3 decades in places like the United States and the United Kingdom, and also in other parts of the developed world, which is important for us to acknowledge. So although I don't have any evidence that it is deliberate, but I think it is useful for us to remind ourselves that in retrospect, the Volcker raising of interest rates in 1980 certainly had that effect of disciplining the working class. But in addition, I want to remind you, in addition, disciplining the developing countries, especially Latin American and African countries at that time. So moving on very I think it is not incorrect to say that Volcker's intervention certainly ended the inflation of that period. So all you had was stagnation. Yeah? So basically the 1980s was characterized by stagflation in most of the world, not only in the rich countries, but also in Latin America, the talk about the lost decade, and in Africa, a lost quarter of a century. But in the case of what has been happening so far, in the case of interest rates going up so far, the situation is actually worsening in the world rather than improving. So inflation is not getting any better, partly because the reasons why inflation is taking place right now, the supply side disruptions, which are sometimes deliberate, as in the case of sanctions, are things which are not being addressed at all. And so we have a situation where we are, in a sense, hurting ourselves. Now, just let me pause a little bit to just remind ourselves that if one overemphasizes economic stabilization, you basically have the a likely course of action where you basically you basically have the red line, and only if you basically take sufficient fiscal effort and to foster long-term and appropriate fiscal effort to foster long-term growth do we have the second scenario of fostering represented by the dark blue line. Now, let me move on very quickly to re-emphasize this basic point which I've just made, that what we need right now is fiscal spending, not only to buffer the adverse effects of the economic downturn by enabling people, especially the poor people, to counter the decline in aggregate demand, one of the things which I just want to emphasize, that many people say, how does putting money in poor people's hands actually and help the economy to improve? Well, we actually did some work when I was in Rome at the Food and Agriculture Organization, and my colleagues there actually did a lot of empirical work to show that when poor people could take care of their very, very basic needs, they would spend whatever little they could afford on actually enhancing their productive assets, on getting some fertilizer, on getting hose and other kinds of farming implements. So I think it's very important to recognize that even poor people have to think about the trade-off between consumption and production, of spending on consumption and production. Now, of course, for others who are in a better situation, it is also important to lay the foundations for future growth. Now, I don't want to get into too many details on this, but there's a great deal of recent work which has been showing that that social protection actually enhances aggregate demand, and also that universal healthcare financing actually enhances not only human resources but also economic progress in very, very crucial ways. And where it is possible to put some effort into investment and technology promotion, the consequences are very important. One of the things we proposed about almost a decade and a half ago was the whole idea of a global Green New Deal. And the difference between the New Deal, of course, and the global Green New Deal is not only the green element, which, to be fair, even Roosevelt had the green elements in his view, but it's also important to recognize that there has to be a global sharing, global cooperation. And this is why the recent decision of the World Trade Organization not to support the Indian-South African proposal to have a waiver on patents to deal with the pandemic is a real slap in the face for developing countries, and basically sets back any progress, including the progress which was achieved by Madiba, the first president of the new South Africa. And of course, I personally would always make a plea for trying to improve human nutrition. And this is a issue which we don't have time to get into right now. Now, I think it's also important to recognize that what happened with so-called unconventional monetary policies, especially in the rich countries, which particularly in the West, which were introduced from around 2010 or so, was that much of this money, especially in the United States, did not go towards enhancing economic capacities and capabilities and output. Instead, it was used by owners of financial assets to enhance their economic leverage in order to accumulate further. And this, of course, also meant that what many people thought was a desirable thing actually was betrayed. So one has to also recognize that the low interest rate policies of the last decade were largely squandered for the interests of the rich. And it's important for us to also recognize that that we need to think also very seriously about investing well. Okay, it's not just good enough to spend money, but we especially for developing countries, you have very limited resources. You have to spend those resources well, and unfortunately, there has been a tremendous propaganda campaign over the recent decades, discrediting discretionary public policies such as industrial policy and so on and so forth. Some recently, there has been a change of heart in the West, and this might give some scope in developing countries, and perhaps this is why Germany has taken over the leadership of UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which the US and UK have stayed out of. Now, it is important for us to recognize that it's important to get policies right as far as possible, and that when you have abuse and corruption, it does not do much for enhancing the credibility of macroeconomic policy, especially fiscal policy. And this is very clear, for example, in what has happened in Sri Lanka in the recent period. So, so what we have had as a consequence of the kind of fiscal consolidation which we've had in the recent period, of course, has been contractionary effects, and fiscal policy has been quite has not been cyclical, and so on and so forth. Many of the criteria which I suggested earlier, and has actually been to the contrary. And this again is due not only to the poor recommendations of influential organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank and so on and so forth, but also very, very importantly, it has been due to the intellectuals, due to the academics who have been responsible for providing ostensibly independent research, some of it dishonest and based on false premises, but grossly misleading, which has been hugely problematic for developing countries in particular. Because developing countries, unfortunately, many developing countries are in the unfortunate situation of developing, of accepting policies from, which are recommended by Western countries, or basically preferred by credit rating agencies and such like, rather than thinking through the concrete problems they have, partly because they do not get sufficient intellectual support for this. This is why it becomes very important, and I'm very glad that Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar is going to be one of the discussants, because he has played a very important role in advancing thinking about macro financial issues in very deep, important ways relevant to developing countries. Now, let me move on to emphasize that many people argue that fiscal positions will worsen when you have fiscal spending, and of course that appeals to it seems very intuitive, right? If the government is going to spend more money, it's going to result in the fiscal position of the country concerned is going to be worse. But in fact, the evidence, and this is the evidence from the OECD, yeah, but they don't publicize it. The evidence from the OECD shows that very, very clearly that that fiscal spending in the very short term actually staves off larger fiscal deficits in the medium term, and as a consequence, because you have far more tax revenue, okay, as a consequence, and since the tax revenue takes a little bit away from the growth which happens, you are able, and in the case of the OECD countries, which was surveyed by the OECD, it was found that the tax revenue was 4 times the cost of the fiscal stimulus in those countries. Now, this of course is important reason why developing countries also need appropriate tax policies. But right now they are hamstrung, partly because the same organization, the OECD, basically has largely prevented developing countries from taxing and receiving much more tax revenue. Now, this is the chart from summarizing the OECD study, which I was referring to earlier. And let me quickly move on to the last part of what I want to talk about, namely the Sustainable Development Goals. These are all quite familiar to you, and I won't summarize the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But I just want to emphasize to you that the lackluster growth in most of the world has basically meant there's almost no way that the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be achieved. And some of the, depending on what you are particularly interested in, I've only highlighted about 3 issues, but I think they are all very, very alarming. You know, if you read the Millennium Development Goals report before the Sustainable Development Goals came in, and even if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals reports, you will see a steady decline of poverty in the world. And I would say that that impression which is created by those numbers is grossly misleading. Because at the same time, if you look at the FAO numbers, the numbers of people experiencing food security has been rising for almost a decade now. Okay, and similarly, we have seen that although there was some decline in global inequality due to some kind of statistical factors, which I won't get into right now, we have actually seen an increase in global inequality. And I'm not suggesting it has been a steady increase. As I suggested earlier, in some economies, during the pandemic relief measures actually did decrease inequality in some ways. Not in all ways, but certainly in some ways. At the current rate of global warming, we are talking about likelihood of reaching 2.8 degrees Celsius, well over almost double the 1.4 degrees Celsius, which is the internationally agreed norm of the IPCC and others. Now, other sustainability indicators are also atrocious, and I don't have time to get into all of that right now. But I don't want to sound too alarmist, but I think it's very difficult not to be alarmist in this kind of situation. And we need to think very seriously about what needs to be done. And of course, the whole question is, what can be done in this situation? You know, I've already gone through these issues on this particular slide, so I won't try to summarize all this. But I have to emphasize that the last decade, the last dozen years since the global financial crisis has seen a steady deterioration, not only in the conditions which developing countries face, but on almost every major struggle. Okay, we have seen a decline, the rejection of the waiver request. We have seen the situation of the Ukraine war. The Americans basically have this view that, oh, Russia is nothing more than a gas pump for Europe. But if you look much more carefully at what is happening in Russia and the significance of Russia, Russia supplies a great amount of, Russia together with Ukraine supplies a great amount of wheat to the world. Together with Belarus, it produces a great amount of fertilizers. And so what the impact of this is that not only do you have the cuts in wheat supplies in the short term, you also have medium-term setbacks in terms of the cut off of fertilizer. Okay. Now there are some naive people who actually says, oh, it's good to get rid of all these fertilizers because then we can move to organic agriculture. But look at what happened in Sri Lanka. You have to plan a transition to agroecology. You have to plan a transition to nature-based agriculture. You just cannot just cut off the dependency which has already built up over decades. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that that development finance has also been diverted away from its original purposes, and now all kinds of things qualify as development finance. So-called blended finance, which is being used to promote financial interests, and other kinds of things are being development finance is being diverted for such purposes. Even housing refugees is considered development finance now. So you can see that not only has there been a decline of ODA, of overseas development assistance, since the end of the Cold War, we have seen a further decline because of this of the situation which has prevailed in recent years. So I think, friends, I don't mean to be too alarmist, but I think we are living in very, very dangerous times. And my fear is that there's no alternative. There's no alternative in the sense that people do not readily turn to any attractive alternative. Instead, what we are seeing is that many people, out of despair or for whatever reason, are turning to jingoist responses, including the kind of ethno-populism which I referred to earlier. And so we are living in a very, very dangerous world where the threat of war is becoming far more serious. But much of this can be traced, of course, to the economic and social conditions which we all face and the world faces, and the most precarious among us have the greatest difficulty coping with. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to a debate over some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jomo, for enlightening us and bringing us up to date with the current situation. Indeed, it is very grim. So we look forward to an intervention from our first discussant now, Dr. C.P. Chandrasekhar. I'll formally introduce him. Dr. Chandrasekhar has taught for more than 3 decades at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU University in New Delhi. He is currently Senior Research Fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He has published widely in academic journals and is the co-author of Crisis as Conquest, Learning from East Asia. That came out from Orient Longman, and I have the title, The Market That Failed, Neoliberal Economic Reforms in India, by Left Books. Demonetization Decoded, A Critique of India's Currency Experiment, by Routledge, and Karl Marx's Capital and the Present, 4 essays, by Tulika. He is a columnist for The Frontline and the Hindu Business Line. Dr. Chandrasekhar, please, your intervention.
Thank you. I must thank the South Forum and Laukinchi for inviting me to be a discussant for what has turned out to be this overarching, amazingly rich presentation by Jomo. And it's very difficult in a few minutes to discuss all of the points that he's raised. So what I'll try and do is maybe underline what my interpretation of a couple of 2 or 3 of the points that he made, which I think are quite striking, and look briefly at the implications of that. The first point, which of course is implicit throughout his reasoning, is that in some sense, if we look at today's developments, if we look at the crisis which came because of the pandemic, which very often is presented as something which is exogenous, even though we do know that it was a long failure of the health system, which actually allows for the possibility of a situation in which we cannot face a pandemic of this kind. But both the pandemic, as well as, and of course, the response to the pandemic in the form of brutal shutdowns, lockdowns, and so on, that, as well as the Ukraine war, are very often now presented as the crisis of capitalism. That really, it's as if there's a whole history which is forgotten, whereas what Jomo, I think, was trying to underline was that even before COVID-19, or C19 as his slides put it, even before COVID-19, the process of the internal contradictions of a system which had evolved in sort of complex directions in the period after the Bretton Woods era, that had actually led up to a situation in which capitalism in some sense had entered into a crisis which seemed to be much more of a crisis than the periodic cyclical fluctuations that we've seen at different points of time in its history. So we are really looking at something deeper that, of course, COVID-19 mattered. Its impact was devastating. Of course, the war or the invasion of Ukraine is an issue which affects the global and integrated global economy. But the fact of the matter is that we should not actually, the vulnerability which has been exposed by these shocks was actually a vulnerability which was embedded in a long history or long post-war history of the kind that JOMO detailed. The second point, I think, which I would like to take out of this is, I mean, that there is an interesting difference between what happened post, of course, the Great Depression. The Great Depression, as he said, finally lasted till the end of the Second World War. And as many have argued, part of the reason we came out of the world came out of the Great Depression was because of the war itself and the stimulating effect it had on economic activity. But the basic point is that the response to the Great Depression resulted in the Bretton Woods era. The era which we know was in some sense the golden age of capitalism. It's an exceptional period, the period from the end of the Second World War till about the end of the 1960s or the middle of the 1970s was an exceptional period in the history of capitalism. We have not seen such a period in which we had in the metropolitan centers of world capitalism a combination of relatively good growth, low unemployment or near full employment, and low inflation. To actually have a combination of growth, low unemployment or near full employment and low inflation was something which was completely unusual for capitalism. And this resulted in a sort of argument that finally governments or the elite of capitalism had discovered ways to deal with the instability which characterizes that system. We put behind us the Great Depression. We put behind us the cyclical fluctuations which characterize capitalism, the instability that characterizes capitalism was the argument at that point of time. But what JOMO was trying to say is that actually we moved out of that. We moved out of there, and we moved out of there. Why? We moved out of there because of the fact that that system could not last, because finally the inherent contradictions of capitalism overtook the system. And in particular, we know that the contradiction which mattered quite crucially in a proximate sense was that one of the reasons why you had the great success of the Golden Age was because of the fact that the banking crisis of the 1930s led up to interventions which actually held back finance and tried to promote the real economy, to promote productive activity in the real economy. So it was between the Second World War and the 1970s was the period of the most stringent regulation of finance that we've seen under capitalism. And the most stringent country in which the regulations were most stringent was the United States, where because of Glass-Steagall, McFadden-Pepper, many laws which had been put in place, you actually had intense regulation of finance. And even if people say that you cannot prove that the regulation of finance gave you the golden age, what we definitely do know is that because you regulated finance, you did not have the golden age. So definitely regulation of finance is not something which is bad for the system. And of course, we know that subsequently the absence of regulation or the removal of regulation leads to crises of different kinds, leading up, of course, to the global financial crisis of 2008-9. Now, the thing is, why did we move out of that golden age? The reason we moved out of that golden age was that you could not, beyond a point, get this sort of threefold benefit in terms of high growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. Capitalism entered a phase in the 1960s, by the middle of the 1960s, and then it accelerated with inflation. And if you have regulation of interest rates, if you have regulation of finance when interest rates are going up, then obviously people say that, listen, I'm not getting very much money for putting my savings aside because it's being eroded by inflation. So there was a walkout of the banking system, as it were, a disintermediation, which undermined the ability of the government to continue to regulate finance. And that led to liberalization of the kind which we saw resulted in the blooming of the sort of the rapid growth of finance, the increase in the share of financial profits in total corporate profits, and so on and so forth, all the things which have been spoken of in the years since the global financial crisis. Now, the thing is, we know that this liberalization, therefore, was not something which was done because some bright men under capitalism, because normally it's men who make these policies, some bright men under capitalism decided that, okay, the best way to go about it is actually to liberalize that. No, regulation is very bad. It was because of the fact that you could not sustain the regulation, which gave you the golden age. And that led to all of the problems that we had. Now, the thing is, one of the things that led up to, we had the banking crisis of the 1980s, we had the dot-com bust, we had many things, but it finally led up to 2007-8, which was a crisis which was expected to be as bad as the Great Depression. It was saved because of massive state intervention, both in a fiscal sense as well as in terms of monetary policy. But the point is, if we look at the response to that crisis as compared to the response to the Great Depression, what JOMO is trying to point out, I think, in quite sharply, is that it did not get to actually a situation where things improved. It did not get us into a situation where we possibly had a new golden age, where actually capitalism learned its lessons. Rather, what we had is a situation where after a certain period, you decided that the only way to deal with this crisis and all subsequent crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic-induced crisis, is to pump huge amounts of cheap money into the system. And that cheap money not only resulted in speculation in the centers of global capitalism, in the city of London, in New York, in Frankfurt, and so on and so forth, but that speculative flow actually entered into the developing countries, and not merely the so-called emerging markets, but even poorer countries. And look at Sri Lanka. Look at the amount of sovereign borrowing, issues of international sovereign bonds that it has engaged. So you actually you have a situation in which, as I said, you do not have a response to the global financial crisis, which creates an environment in which it appears as if capitalism, having learned its lessons, but rather it puts in place a system which at least is better than what we have, even if not the best. But it actually put in place now a system in which it just injected cheap capital, financial capital, which fuels speculation, which at a point of time when the real economy was in slump and a crisis, you had a boom in the stock markets, in the bond markets all across the world. And you had this money flowing into developing countries. And some of these developing countries saw this as an opportunity, which it wasn't, because it enhanced their vulnerability. And the immediate case, which we know, there are many others, is Sri Lanka, which actually borrowed so massively, such that it actually thought that it could, sort of brush away all of the problems that it had, including the problems which were created because of the pandemic and its impact on tourism earnings, on export earnings, and so on and so forth. But you had this huge amount of debt, which is today, it has defaulted on, and so it's a sovereign default, which is a rare occurrence, at least in Asian history. We've seen it in Latin America, but not in Asia. So the point is, you obviously therefore have a situation in which capitalism doesn't have the kind of flexibility, the learning ability that it had maybe in that phase, where because of the devastation of two world wars and the Great Depression, it was forced into a situation where it had to, in some sense, reform itself. But that reform could only go that far because of the fact that the inherent contradictions of capitalism finally asserted itself, and we got what we did. Now, if you have that, and I just want to, and if you have this kind of reliance on that kind of what are called unconventional monetary policies, which is near zero interest rates and large amount of money being injected into the system, you obviously increase the vulnerability of the system, because you now are saying that I'm not actually going to restructure the real economy, because in some sense, what you had was a reversal of reality in the ideology which came after the 1970s sort of slowdown or crisis under capitalism, which is, instead of saying that the problem was with the real economy which needs to be fixed, you actually said that the problem is one in which we hadn't adequately used the monetary lever. Now, if you do this and increase vulnerability, what happens? You obviously are in a situation now where, because of this large buildup of financial capital across the globe, including in developing countries, across the globe, there is a backlash against the state adopting any kind of proactive fiscal policy, which Jomo was talking about. To a certain extent, we saw a little bit in the industrial countries after COVID, but we didn't even see that in the developing countries. In fact, inequality rose because of the fact that the developed countries did use fiscal policy to a certain extent, whereas developing countries did not have the fiscal space to try and do that because of the sort of pressure of finance, which is accumulated, or speculative finance, and speculative finance does not like a government which adopts proactive fiscal policies. Now, if that be the case, then what happens is you just continue to do the same thing. But you know that you can't continue in a world in which you have near zero interest rates, because zero is some kind of a lower bound. We did have negative interest rates in a couple of countries where actually you were being given money in which you're saying that if you actually use this money to lend, then we'll actually give you more money rather than take an interest from you. You had negative interest rates in Switzerland and elsewhere. But the point is that there is a lower bound. So you can't continue to do the same thing. And then if you have a new crisis, which came, as Jomo pointed out, even before COVID, and then you have COVID, and then you have the crisis induced by Ukraine, what do? You can't continue to do the old kind of thing, because now, in addition to the fact that you pushed monetary policy to its extreme, you're confronted with inflation. Once again, you have the same problem that you had in the late 60s and 70s. Suddenly, from the so-called era of great moderation, where capitalism for many years, because it had relocated its capacities to cheap labor locations, had very low interest rates, and because it had suppressed commodity prices, you ended up with a situation in which, and I'll just end, you ended up with a situation where you could control inflation, or inflation controlled itself in some sense because of the structure of the system. And now you're back to high inflation, and you therefore cannot use monetary policy. So in some sense, it really is a world in which the elites cannot rule in the same way as they ruled in the past. Definitely as far as economic policy is concerned, even if nationalism and ethno-populism makes them think that they can rule in new ways. And as we saw in Sri Lanka, the people are not willing to be ruled in the old way. Now, if there is a definition of crisis which is as starkly revealed by the current reality, it is when the elites cannot rule in the same old way, and the people refuse to be ruled in the same old way. That's when you really have a crisis, and that's where we are. And I don't want to add to the alarm which Jomo referred to, but I do think that solidarity between human beings is enough to be able to push us into finding a solution once a crisis of this intensity asserts itself. Thank you, and I'm sorry I took a little longer, and for speaking so fast.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chandrasekhar. Now I'll give the floor to our next discussant, who is Professor Anu Chenoy. Professor Anu Chenoy is the former dean at the School of International Studies at JNU University in New Delhi. She has been chairperson of Area Studies, director in the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies. She has written many books, monographs, and articles in the domain of security studies, development studies, and gender studies. She has held short-term consultancies with the International Committee of the Red Cross, UNESCO, Action Aid International, UN Women, UN Peacekeepers. She has also evaluated the work of organizations like Focus on the Global South and the Asia-Europe People's Forum. The floor is yours, Professor Chenoy.
Thank you, Tung and Kinchi. Actually, being a discussant came as a bit of a shock to me, because I actually just came to listen to Professor Jomo and to my friend Chandru. And suddenly I was told that I have to be a discussant, a task much beyond my depth in this kind of tour de force that Jomo presented. I think Chandru commented on it very astutely. So actually, I'm going to raise 2 or 3 wide kind of questions which came to my mind while Jomo was speaking. One was the fact of these new rising contradictions because of the change of policies in the Western world where suddenly they, as an extension of what he said about reshoring, now it is gone to nearshoring and trade between friends, as opposed to the earlier policies of flag follows, trade follows flag. It's now trade will follow friend. So will this deepen contradictions between the West and the emerging economies, especially China, and then lead to some kind of changes? My second kind of question is about the trillions of finance outside the control of the IMF, like in BlackRock, and that which is moving. How are you going to factor this in really? And my third question is that, are we likely to see a more multipolar political economy, global political economy, just like because a large part of the global South is pushing for a multipolar world, whereas Western hegemony is looking for primacy and unipolarity. But it seems to me that some kind of multipolar political economy is actually emerging. It may be very weak now, but the ineffectiveness of sanctions, the decline of the decline in the use of the dollar to almost now 50% in contrast to 80%, the recent movement of the Chinese reserves in the US Fed, all these seem to indicate to a person who doesn't really know economics like me that there seem to be some shift in terms of the monopoly and hegemony of finance and trade, which we saw till recently. So that's where I'll end. And thank you for this brilliant lecture, really, Jomo. And thank you for your comments as usual, Chandru. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chenoy. I'd like to use my privilege as moderator to ask a few questions of Dr. Jomo. I have a few questions, but what seems striking in your presentation is I guess the lack of maybe intellectual resources people in the developing world have, to counter what seems like the hegemony of the global North. So I'd actually like to ask you, given that the university system for many decades now has been under the control, of course, of Western knowledge hegemony. I mean, do you feel it is a bit late at this point to turn the tide? So that's a very broad question. The second question that I had pertained to you mentioning MMT, modern monetary theory. You did say that there was no need to resort to MMT. I guess my question is, why not, or what do you think are its shortcomings, given that what you seem to recommend appear to be very much in line with fiscal spending and post-Keynesian policies. So I was wondering what reservations you have about MMT. Thank you, Dr. Jomo. I'll let you respond to both Dr. Chandra and Professor Chenoy before we take some more questions.
Thank you, Chandru, and thank you, Anu, for your very kind comments, and Dr. Ko as well. I feel disinclined to get to say too much at this stage because I would very much like to hear from other participants, especially those who may not be so like-minded. But let me try to deal with the Anuj Chenoy's comments very quickly on the question of reshoring, nearshoring, and what Janet Yellen proposed earlier this week, friendshoring. I mean, basically what they have done and what has happened over the last couple of decades has been a major disruption to the world they built. For the latter part of the 20th century, there was the claim that globalization was the answer. Globalization was what exactly globalization meant, of course, was problematic. Many people had different ideas about what globalization meant. And as I suggested earlier, the financial globalization was far more significant than trade globalization, if you want to make that distinction. So what has happened is that, for example, in 2008 and 2009, it was the OECD countries who imposed all kinds of sanctions, who led the reversal of globalization. I don't want to exaggerate the significance of this phenomenon and call it deglobalization, but let's face it, the era of high globalization, especially high trade globalization, is over. Okay, so we have to recognize this, and so what we are seeing now is a situation of an attempt to reverse a process which cannot possibly be reversed. The corporations concerned are not going to go back to the US. They're not going to go back to Japan. And it's very important, therefore, to recognize that these other attempts of nearshoring and friendshoring and so on are a polite way of saying, let's continue the encirclement of China, let's continue the siege of China, but at the same time, let's recognize that we cannot completely reverse it, and let's try to have a new division of labor, minus China, presumably minus Russia, minus Iran, minus whoever is not acceptable. I think that's all it comes to, is we are grasping at straws at different ways to save the failed project of globalization. I didn't understand Anu's second question, but let me proceed to the third one, and perhaps later you might remind me what the second. I understood that there was a lot of money lying around, but it's not clear to me what the question was aiming for. But as far as I don't think the choice in the world today is between a multipolar world versus a unipolar world. I think some of the BRICS, do talk about a multipolar world, but let's face it, many of the BRICS are essentially not also inclined towards sub-imperialism, and the smaller countries in their respective regions and so on are also resistant of this. If you take your BRIC, and you can find the dissent against that. So it's not that choice. It's not a choice as if the entire developing world is behind a multipolar world where the BRICS participate in the G20 on behalf of the developing world. No, we want a world where everybody has a say, and where there is representation, that representation has to be fair and representative representation. It cannot be self-selected, which is basically what Paul Mata and Larry Summers did in 2008 when they upgraded the G20 from a meeting of finance ministers into a meeting of heads of governments. And then the Unipolar World Project had a moment, I think, during the 1990s, when after the end of the Cold War, especially in the US, there was talk about sovereigntism and so on and so forth. That moment, I think, ended. Partly it ended because of resistance, not from the South, but resistance from Europe. Okay? Now, that resistance from Europe has largely gone. And I would suggest today that we are back, as it is now often said, we now have a new Cold War. It's not between, it's a new Cold War of a different order. It's not really between capitalism and socialism, or whatever you want to describe the first Cold War as being. But nonetheless, it is a very serious Cold War. Some people would say it's the US versus the rest, but that doesn't quite capture the allies of both. So what we have now is a choice where a new Cold War is emerging, and the choice for smaller developing countries, in my view, is to create the space, for a new non-alignment, a non-alignment appropriate to these times. Because let's face it, only an active non-alignment can be a force for peace. Left to their own devices, the protagonists in this bipolar world, if you will, are not about to settle things amicably. Okay, so the peace efforts, which everybody from all kinds of people are involved with, need to be greatly extended. Now, as far as Dr. Koh's point is concerned, I don't have any simple answer. Together with various friends and colleagues, including Professor Chandrasekhar and others, we have been trying to make a dent in terms of offering a different perspective in economics, rooted in the conditions of the South and so on. But at the same time, I don't think we have made much of a dent. Let's be quite honest. I mean, that doesn't mean we give up, but and thanks to forums such as the present forum, we do have an opportunity and to do so. And early next month, the colleagues and Ideas have organized a meeting, which everybody is invited to follow online. By contacting the Ideas website. But I think right now it's not, the incentives, we don't have enough incentives to get people to think otherwise. My late friend Tandika Makandawire, who used to be the chair of the advisors to Ideas, he actually wrote a piece how during the second half of the 20th century, African economists were being trained in one thing after another. But the Western development fads were so fickle that by the time they finished their PhD training, the fads had changed. So you can get trained in cost-benefit analysis, and then suddenly by the time you're finished, a cost-benefit analysis is no longer the vogue. And then so eventually you have a great deal of cynicism by this, and people, and the pressures of modern academia are such that you are forced to publish in certain types of journals, to conform to certain types of norms, and those norms are very much defined by the West. So it's an uphill task for economists, yeah, I could go on, but I think let me go to your last point about MMT. I think the basic insight of MMT is not an original insight. Okay, and since it's not an original insight, let's give credit where it is due. Okay, as to the role of money in society. So for me, Keynesian monetary policy is been captured by, has been resuscitated in the form of MMT. But let us remember that MMT pretends more. And there are people who speak in the name of MMT who basically take the view that, you know, the issue of fiat money is unlimited. Okay, and this, in my view, is not only misleading. It is hugely reckless. It is reckless for the countries concerned. I mean, you know, I need not draw your attention to the usual, you know, examples of, you know, how all this failed in Zimbabwe and in a host of other countries. I think we have, you know, part of the challenge of being taken seriously is being taken seriously as a credible alternative. Okay, and so, for example, when friends criticize the so-called demonetization in India, it was the credibility of their criticisms which enhanced their acceptability. You know, it's not you know, it's not. I just think that, you know, it is important to be quite responsible about this. It's well and good to sit in the States and talk about this. It's another thing to sit in a relatively small country and for example, in Sri Lanka today, and advocate for MMT, or for that matter, any other country. So I think one has to be very responsible in thinking seriously about what alternative monetary policy can be, because can be determines what it should be. It's not as if the options are unlimited. Okay, so I think let me stop here so that we can have a debate, including many of the other friends who have joined this today's session.
I see some chats. In fact, there's a question, or there's a comment from Ashley Damon. I'll just ask if Ashley would like to just switch on his mic and actually speak, because it's a rather long comment.
Hello, Tungyi and JOMO, thank you very much. I wasn't actually meaning for this to be read out. It's actually just something that Vladimir Putin said yesterday, which goes to I guess the multipolarity and perhaps the hope for the non-Western world. I can read it out if you like, and for everybody to listen to, but it might take a minute or two to read it all out. Are you happy for me to do so?
Please, Ashley.
Okay. Okay. So this was Putin yesterday. He said he was talking about the forum, I think, that he was speaking at, and this mechanism is fully consonant with the tasks of our internal development and the time when truly revolutionary transformations are gaining momentum and getting stronger. These enormous changes are irreversible, of course. National and global processes are underway to develop the fundamentals and principles of a harmonious, fairer, and a more community-focused and safe world order as an alternative to the existing world order, or the unipolar world order in which we lived, and which, because of its nature, is definitely becoming a brake on the development of our civilization. And that's the first paragraph. I'll just scroll down to, actually I'll read from the model of total domination by the so-called golden billion is unfair. Why should this golden billion, which is only a part of the global population, dominate everyone else and enforce its rules of conduct that are based on the illusion of exceptionalism? It divides the world into first and second-class people, and is therefore essentially racist and neo-colonial. The underlying globalist and pseudo-liberal ideology is becoming increasingly more like totalitarianism and is restraining creative endeavour and free historical creation. One gets the impression that the West is simply unable to offer the world a model for the future of its own. Indeed, it was no accident that the Golden Billion attained its goal and achieved quite a lot. But it got there not because it implemented certain concepts. It mainly got to where it is by robbing other peoples in Asia and Africa. That is how it was. India was robbed for an extensive period of time. This is why the elite of the Golden Billion are terrified of other global development centres potentially coming up with their own development alternatives. No matter how much the West and the supranational elite strive to preserve the existing order, a new era and a new stage in world history are coming. Only genuine sovereign states are in a position to ensure a high growth dynamic and become a role model for others in terms of standards of living and quality of life. The protection of traditional values and high humanistic ideals and development models where an individual is not a means but the ultimate goal. Sovereignty is about freedom of national development and thus the development of every individual. It is about the technological, cultural, intellectual, and educational solvency of a state. That is what it is. No doubt, responsible, active, and nationally minded and nationally orientated civil society is the most important component of sovereignty. So I'll finish it there. It's quite a long quote, but I just thought that, well, that's a major world leader talking about an alternative to the existing world that we have, and something that I thought might give us some hope. But that was just a comment, and if JOMO or anybody else wants to provide their thoughts.
Thank you, Ashley. Any thoughts? I thought that captured the gist of tonight's talk. If there are no comments, there's a comment in the chat. I'll invite the person to ask the question. So is it Lu Zhihao?
In fact, my question is on the institutional basis of applying macroeconomic policies that is proactive, because after the Second World War in the 50s, in the 60s, it was possible to do that because we have almost in the entire world a nation state. The model of the state is it's designed to do that job, but now it does seem to me not really a case. It could be a case for China, maybe, but for a lot of developing countries, not the case. Even some countries in the north, like the European countries under the European Union. So they don't have that sovereignty anymore, sovereignty of the people. And they're in fact ruled by the financial classes, and the financial classes are not naturally national, they could be international. So what can we envisage to do that, to apply the macroeconomic policy which was formulated by the Keynes at the time? And do you find that few elements of getting a control of the state machine in the movement of the ethno-populism, is that an expression of that struggle, or is fairly it's more cultural movement that is not that cannot be labeled as an economic struggle to get on the state? So thank you for.
It is true that that there is a presumption that that it is a presumption that policies are made by sovereign states. Throughout the presentation, I acknowledge that that sovereign states among developing countries are greatly circumscribed by a whole variety of factors, which I cannot possibly try to summarize very simply. So the room for maneuver is very limited. Some of us refer to this as policy space, the ability to do things and not to do and so on is determined by the amount of policy space we have. And there are different kinds of policy space: fiscal space, and monetary policy space, and so on and so forth. And again, it is very difficult to generalize across all these things. So the first commentator is quite correct in saying that there is this presumption, but it's also the presumption is a very qualified presumption, that we are not assuming that everybody is able to do anything they like, regardless of circumstances. Now, the second part of that comment was on ethno-populism, I think. I'm guessing here. And my argument about ethno-populism is that I think it's useful for us, unlike in the West. In the West, there is a tendency to talk about populism as a reactionary force. I do think that populism is potentially progressive. It's very rare and conditions have to be appropriate. But when you think about so-called national democratic struggles, they undoubtedly involve a coalition of different interest groups, classes, if you will. And so this coalition of classes is extremely important. This coalition of who leads those coalition of classes is often decisive for the outcome and the compromises which are made. So in certain circumstances, this coalition might be led by very left-wing parties. In certain circumstances, it might be led by other types of parties, which the left might support, and often if the left doesn't support it, there's nothing redeeming, there's nothing progressive about it. But having said that, what the point I was trying to make, you see, in the 1980s, there was a literature denouncing Latin American regimes who were fiscally active as profligate and subject to what was called macroeconomic populism. And so populism became a bad word for economists in a very knee-jerk kind of way. I was trying to suggest that you can have a different type of populism, and that kind of populism is in a sense much more conservative. The kind of populism which was much more conservative in many parts of the world is often defined by what I call ethno-populism. Okay, now ethno-populism is not necessarily related to ethnicity narrowly considered. It could be related to religion, the view that one religion is superior to all others and has by divine right the right to rule over others. This is characteristic of a number of regimes in the world, so I would define that as ethno-populism, a kind of ethno-populism. It might be related to ethnicity, but usually it invokes cultural symbols, and in that I think the commentator is absolutely correct. But the fact that it evokes cultural symbols doesn't mean it doesn't have a content. So if you take, for example, the Hindutva regime, which rules in India today, where you have the invocation of Hindu, ostensibly Hindu values and a right to Hindu supremacy, there is also, together with that, there are certain policies which are very, very biased towards particular types of class interests, which many others in this discussion tonight are better qualified to comment on. So, and likewise, when you invoke Muslim, Islamic, or Christian, chauvinism, it's not as if there's no class content to that. It's not as if there's no economic content to that. Okay, of course there can be important differences. You have the theology of liberation Christians, and you have the Christianity which Trump has successfully appealed to. So I think we need to begin to recognize that cultural symbols are extremely important, but not devoid of economic and social implications. And this is what I was emphasizing. Now, I think Mr. Liu Jihao is basically making that point as well, if I understand him correctly. And so I don't think further comment and perhaps is necessary. But unlike if Chandru would like to make additional comments or Anu Chinoy, otherwise I think there are others who can contribute to this debate fruitfully.
有一个中国听众叫赵天宇。
There's a Chinese audience named Zhao Tianyu. His question is to Mr. JOMO. So the question is, what is the reason for the medium-term tax revenue growth from physical investment? Can it still have the effect in the current situation where the supply chain is being affected?
I think
yes,
Mr. Zhao is quite correct that a lot depends on your policy environment and the ability of the OECD countries to benefit, to collect much more in tax revenue from their fiscal spending is precisely because they are much more sovereign in the sense of having much more coherent policies. One of the big problems of many developing countries is that they give so many incentives to favor foreign investment, especially including foreign direct investment, that the net benefits tend to be diminished as a consequence. But again, it depends once again on the countries concerned. Some countries have been far more successful in collecting, in benefiting fiscally from investors, and others have not been. But I think the big problem was, of course, this kind of supply side economic thinking, which was introduced during the early Reagan period by Professor Arthur Laffer, which I can't resist but say was quite laughable. But even the chief economic advisor, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Marty Feldstein, as soon as he stepped down as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, he went to the National Bureau of Economic Research and wrote a paper basically discrediting the views of Arthur Laffer. But lo and behold, 3 decades later, when Trump came back in, Arthur Laffer became the vogue, and he was invoked several times when Trump was trying to justify his tax cuts. And now we find that this kind of thinking is very widespread. Is very widespread not only in the US, but also beyond in other OECD countries and beyond. But nonetheless, this OECD study, which I referred to earlier, showed that the OECD countries nonetheless were still collecting far more taxes. And we have to recognize that there's a great variety among OECD countries, and many OECD countries actually still collect quite a lot of taxes, and the ones who have been most generous in reducing their taxes have actually been the Anglophone countries, such as the UK but also Australia and so on and so forth. And one of the problems with electoral politics when this kind of ideology prevails is that, is that the increased tax revenue, when governments compete for political support, and very importantly for political financing from business, when they compete for political financing for business, they are very generous in giving all kinds of so-called incentives to business. These incentives actually are basically giveaways to business. And that's why you find that the shape of the tax system over many generations, over recent generations, has actually become distinctively less progressive, with the shift from direct taxation to consumption taxation, the decline of the significance of wealth taxation, the decline of even income taxation, the decline in the progressivity of income taxation and wealth taxation, and so on, and the shift towards consumption taxation, and so on. So all this have basically had the effect of achieving what Mr. Chow's questions implied. And unfortunately, much of this thinking has also affected many developing countries. So there is a real problem, but I have to emphasize that as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, others in the discussion, there is no study of other developing countries. And one of the good things which has happened recently is that there is far more critical thinking about taxation in developing countries, which has emerged in recent times.
Thank you, Dr. Jomo. I saw a news item the other day of Boris Johnson leaving Parliament. And I don't know if the audience or you are aware, but one of his last statements was that, that we should deregulate and cut taxes. Exactly what you're saying. That the government should continue to do that. So it seems like this is a monumental challenge today when states, states are abdicating that responsibility to pursue any policy to, as you say, to self-regulate or to let corporations self-regulate. I don't know what the response to that is. But in any case, there's another question from the floor, and that is to you, Dr. Jomo. It says, can you please elaborate on today's Cold War, the sides to this Cold War, and what you call, and your call for non-alignment?
Yes, I think we have to recognize that the Cold War is hottening up in very, very dangerous ways. This is not a phenomenon which has just happened after the war, the Ukraine war began, or with the most recent threats to arm Taiwan and so on and so forth. It has been going on for some time. Okay, and at least in this part of the world, in East Asia, I would date it to President Obama's second term, when he called for a pivot to Asia. In effect, this had begun much earlier. This had begun much earlier, even during Clinton's time, and where there was an attempt to sort of encircle China, but because at that time China was not seen as a particularly strong power or a threat, But I think the foreign policy establishment in the U.S., when John Mearsheimer says it is a mistake to go to war in Ukraine, he's not saying let's have peace. John Mearsheimer is basically saying, Ukraine is a distraction. We should not do that. We should concentrate our focus on China. China is the real enemy, and that's where we need to. So in that sense, Mearsheimer, who is supposed to be in the so-called what the American international relations people call the realist camp, together with the people like Kissinger, Mearsheimer is actually quite different from Kissinger in that respect. So much of this, there's a lot of moving around and so on. So what do we mean by the Cold War today, the new Cold War? The new Cold War is almost defined as the enemies of by who happens to be the enemy of the US. Now, for most developing countries, okay, most developing countries cannot afford to get into to be the subject of the wrath of the US and its allies. This is simply a fact. Okay, so you have very few countries willing to stand up to them. Okay, and it's not that they don't sympathize with the victims, but they basically don't want to. They don't feel that it is advantageous to them because the costs are very high. Okay. At the same time, I think the growing expansion and influence of China is not unproblematic. Okay, there's some people who, for example, I mean, let's face it. The Chinese in China today, it's a mixed economy. It's not a socialist economy. It's not a purely capitalist economy. It's a mixed economy. And in fact, the size of the state sector in China is smaller than in Russia. Okay, but that doesn't make Russia a more socialist economy. Vladimir Putin is very, very clear that what he's interested in is building capitalism. Okay, I think his idea of how to build capitalism is quite wrong, because he basically has consolidated many of the what do you call it, the so-called oligarchs, and they have not contributed and enhanced the process of capital accumulation and enhanced the progress of China, of Russia. So it's a very complex process, and let's face it, even in China today, there are people who want to consolidate the power, for example, of the new tech companies, and there are those who want to resist the emergence of the consolidation of the influence and power of the new tech companies. So all societies are in ferment, and some of those contradictions are healthy, they're desirable, and some of them are downright problematic. And so, as far as I'm concerned, this world has has limited resources. We have a world population, many of whom are living in very, very desperate conditions. Over 1 billion people, for example, do not have electricity. Okay, but are we going to say no electricity to you because we have a problem of global warming, or are we going to bypass the phase of fossil fuel and enable, for example, renewable energy to be made much more available? These are choices which need international cooperation. And let's face it, during the first Cold War, there were a few exceptional moments where the first Cold War actually had desirable results. The Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership challenged President Jimmy Carter to eradicate smallpox within a decade. And lo and behold, the United States accepted that challenge, and together the world eliminated smallpox within a decade. The challenge, I think, was made in 1979. Within a decade, smallpox was history. So when there is cooperation, you can have those kinds of conditions. But who is working for that today in the world? Only a non-aligned movement which does not have a stake in who does not completely align with either camp is capable of offering and pushing for such an alternative. And this is why I do think we need a strong and proactive non-aligned movement. But it's very difficult, because it is very difficult to stand up against powerful countries. So it is a very challenging task, but I do think we have much on we have a tradition which goes back to after the war, in 1947, I think it was, even before India got independence. Nehru called for had an Asian Relations Conference in Delhi. In 1955, in Sukarno had convened the Afro-Asian Solidarity meeting in Bandung. In 1961, Joseph Tito hosted the first non-aligned conference meeting. So that these are important traditions, but we are living in a different world. To just go back to the old non-aligned movement will not be good enough in the present conditions. We need to begin to think of a non-alignment which is appropriate for our times, but also an active non-alignment which basically makes peace the priority for the world today, peaceful conditions and the peaceful resolution of differences, and which basically actively, I used to work for the United Nations, but the United Nations has not done enough to create the conditions for peace. Even people are talking much more about Pope Francesco, rather than So we do not have enough active players in the world, protagonists in the world. We cannot rely on one or two statesmen, say that, like the late Nelson Mandela, who fought. His last struggle was for the public health exception to the TRIPS agreement. But the only reason he had to fight for that was because there was a TRIPS agreement in the first place, which didn't need to come into existence in the first place. So I think we have a strong need for this kind of action, for this kind of cooperation. But this has to be at different levels. It has to be a level of state-to-state relations. We need to have people-to-people relationships, cooperation as well, to further such ends. Thank you.
We'll have one more question from Dr. Lee. Please ask a question.
Mine isn't a question, but to add a small point to what JOMO has just said. And I put it forward in a jokey manner, simply because it may be an idiosyncratic way of looking at a very complex world that we face. And I always said to I am an octogenarian, and that places me, in world history, so to speak. Now, I always feel that I belong to a very, very fortunate generation, because I lived at a period of time when the old Cold War, now we talk of a new Cold War, but the old Cold War was on. When I graduated from the university, I had no difficulty picking up a job as an academic. But today, unless you are over 40, nearing 50, if you're lucky, you may pick up a job. Whereas I graduated at the age of 21 and I picked up a job immediately. And today, I live graciously off my 2 pensions. I live in the UK, so I have my professional pension, occupational pension, and I have my state pension. And I am very, very well off in the sense that I don't have to worry where my next penny is going to come from when I reach out for a luxury product, like, delicious looking cherries I find in a grocer. I don't have to count my pennies. Now, why am I so lucky? I'm so lucky because of the first Cold War. I mean, the West was so frightened of the fact that the world would go communist, that they put into, they execute these policies, measures which will make the Western society more attractive. And so that is why we have the welfare state. And so the NHS, my pensions and everything was dependent entirely on the old Cold War. Now, so as I jokingly said to my friends, I always say when I go and check on my bank account to see if my pensions and so on have come in, I buy myself a drink and I say, "Thank you, Uncle Joe." It's meant as a joke, but the joke is that Stalin made it possible for me to be part of this very fortunate generation. So again, talking purely from the geopolitical point of view, out of pure cynicism, I said we need a second Cold War. Without the second Cold War, I'm afraid what JOMO said about the, the increasing difficult poverty, etc., inequalities will persist. So now, I don't wish for the second Cold War to lead to a real war, nothing of that. Just hoping that, some of the so-called good effects may come off, that the West will be so frightened of China posing as the new threat that they will do something about their own society and to remove some of the poverty, some of the inequalities, some of the many awful problems which now face us all. We do live in a very complex world. So whether my jokey hope will ever be realized remains to be seen. We live in a world of uncertainties, as all of us would agree. Thank you.
I'm afraid I cannot quite agree with that argument. I think that was very crucial to the conditions you enjoy is precisely the struggle of working people in Britain and all over the world, which actually created those conditions. If not for example, the beverage reforms, which provided very important basis for the welfare state, which used to exist in Britain, and the healthcare reforms, if not for what Professor Chandrasekhar referred to earlier as the golden age, the post-war golden age, when finance was prevented from running amok. It was those conditions when you had relatively high growth for at least a quarter of a century that was important. But also, I don't mean to be personal about this, but British colonialism, imperialism was also part of that story. My own country, Malaysia, was actually contributed far more foreign exchange to Britain in the immediate post-war period than Britain could earn for itself, and the rest from the rest of the empire. So I would just qualify that. I think I'm not asking for reparations or anything like that, but I do think it is important for us to recognize that the golden age did make a difference. Undoubtedly, I think that kind of rivalry had it might have triggered a certain degree of technological change, technological progress. I mean, many people would comment, for example, on how the US Defense Department spending resulted in so many important technological innovations, the internet and the CT scan and the MRI and on and on and on. But having said all that, one cannot but weep at how Germany, which could never meet its 0.7% target for overseas development assistance, has basically been able to triple its defense spending in over the last few months. How Boris Johnson completely abandoned even his party colleague David Cameron's claim to have achieved a 0.7%. If you look at Abe Shinzo, the late Abe Shinzo, he has remilitarized Japan in ways which were completely inconceivable for not just the first post-war generation, but the second post-war generation. Even his late father Abe Shintaro was very much against it, and his late grandfather, who was a sort of a peaceful politician, not the paternal grandfather Abe, unlike the maternal grandfather who was basically a Class A war criminal. So we are talking about a very huge increase in military spending in the world today, which the Ukraine war has become an excuse for even further increasing that. Whatever limited foreign aid there is being increasingly diverted for refugees and so on and so forth, rather than reaching people in the global south. I mean, I'm not saying that foreign aid is all that wonderful. There are a huge number of problems associated with it. But the fact of the matter is that all this reorientation of priorities has been all legitimized in the name of the Second Cold War. And in that respect, I think it is in many ways far more insidious, far more dangerous, and precisely because it is often narrowly nationalistic. Despite all the reference to global leadership and so on, it is ultimately very nationalistic, and this is hugely problematic. Yeah, so let me stop there and not. But thank you very much for your comment.
Dr. Chandras, would you like to say something before?
I completely agree that the consequences of colonial transfer, of the sort of tribute which imperialist countries got from the colonies, besides of course the role of the working class in those countries itself, was quite crucial. Besides the fact, of course, that the existence of the Soviet Union gave space to developing countries. I mean, partly non-alignment was also possible because of the fact that there existed this sort of bipolar world with socialism on one side. I just want to say one thing about the taxation issue, if I may, just take half a minute. I think we need to go beyond taxation now, because in some sense, over the years, so much tax concessions have been given by states across the world that we've, in some sense, we are nearing, at least as far as direct tax concessions are concerned, we are nearing some kind of a bottom of the pit. There's a limit to which, there is some lower bound. You can't keep on cutting taxes and cutting. So I think when we look at that, we need to look at two kinds of things. One is the more regressive forms of taxation, which are being adopted. And two, of course, the fact that there are other ways in which the state pays off private capital. One, of course, is privatization. The other is to allow you to monetize assets which were long considered common property, whether it be water or whether, whatever it may be. So the whole thing is, I think, the nature of the use of the fiscal lever by the state has changed so much that we should not only focus on direct tax concessions to capital or the bourgeoisie, whatever it may be, but to look at multiple ways in which fiscal policy becomes a way to engineer a redistribution of income from the bottom of the pyramid to the top, 1, 2, 5, 10%. That there are multiple ways in which fiscal policy plays a role, and maybe we should keep that in mind too. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Any concluding thoughts, Dr. Jomo?
Not really. I thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you very much to both Professor Chandrasekhar and Professor Chennai for their comments, and to everybody else who has also contributed. I was hoping that there would be more of a debate among those who have different interpretations or different readings of world history, but I guess we can't address everything in one session. But for those who might be interested in some of these debates, I would strongly urge them to look at the IDEAS website, which Professor Chandrasekhar has been managing since its inception for a couple of decades, and there is the forthcoming event from the 3rd to the 5th of August, which everybody can follow. And I think some of these issues will be elaborated and further debated in that session. I think Professor Chandrasekhar mentioned the work of the Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik on the history of imperialism, and which is extremely important for our understanding of modern society. Not necessarily in the way which some politicians are seeking reparations and so on, although I don't think that's a bad idea, but I think there is much to be learned from knowing our past, because in a sense the past continues to weigh upon us in very important ways, and even our recent past, what has happened and how we are constrained in various different ways, which we have discussed, some of which have been discussed tonight. I think that will very much shape our options going forward. Yeah, so I do hope those interested will join us, and of course this series also has a number of other relevant and interesting lectures which will be coming up in the near future, and of course from previous years as well. And there's much to be learned in order to inform our efforts to try to change the world. Thank you very much again to everybody, and especially for the organizers for making all this possible.